Okay, first of all, I have changed the name of the program to ho.02.flask API parms. The reason is that HO is hands-on and there's a second hands-on, so that you know which code to use for which hands-on. The first one would be the behavior with trailing slash. And I'll use the same program. I'll use the same API rather, list products, wherein I will get all the product details from the file. That's all I'll do, because it's a very simple behavior that I wanted to show you. But the reason I wanted to show you is because it creates confusions a lot of time. So it's better that you clear the confusion with a hands-on. Okay, so what am I doing is that I'm just reading the file and I'm returning the lines. That's it. Nothing has to be done. And this is the API / list products. And let me start the application. The application has been started. This is my Postman. And let's send some API request. You already know what the endpoint is, which is this one. Now, instead of product category, I'll use list products, which is showing me all the records of the file as usual. This is without trailing slash, but what will I do now is I have not defined the API, or I have not mapped the API with a trailing slash, but I'll use trailing slash here. What would happen? It should error out saying that the URL is not found. Again, this is the API URL and I have added a trailing slash. But in the program, I have defined or I have mapped the API with list product. Now, while mapping, I did not mention trailing slash. So this is how Flask could behave if I add trailing slash and I do not define it in the program. It will give us 404 not found error. Now change it other way around. So before that, let me remove it and press enter. It is working as usual. Now what will I do? I'll add a trailing slash here and then I'll save it. And the reloading is done. Dynamic reloading is done. So let's add trailing slash here. So if I add trailing slash now, I should see the same output. As you can see, I'm getting the same output because this is how I have defined the API. But now let me remove the trailing slash. Now what would happen is Flask could automatically convert it or redirect it to the API which is list products slash. Now if I press enter, you see I am getting the same output. Because behind the scenes what is happening, it is getting converted to slash list products slash. Now if you see the debug mode, right, let me show you the difference between the two. In the first case, when I did not have a trailing slash, this is what it was. So it was working with slash list products and I was getting HTTP 200, which is a successful message. But the moment I added slash, it gave me 404 that the URL not found. Now in this case, I tried with slash, which is normal. It actually worked. It's shown HTTP 200 code, which is a successful message. But with the URL where there is no slash at the end, it says HTTP 308, which is not error. I'll show you what this HTTP 308 is. Let me remove the slash again and try the API. So I've removed the slash, send it, and I'm getting the output. It's not error. And here you see it is without the slash. The HTTP code is 308, and then the 200 is from slash list products, then slash. So what happened? 308 is actually redirection. So HTTP 308 is permanent redirect. That's what it does. What Flask does, if we define an API with a trailing slash and we do not mention trailing slash in the URL, it does a permanent redirect using 308 and then it pulls in the API with the trailing slash. Now that's how the behavior is. So if we do not define trailing slash and send an API request with a trailing slash, we'll get an error. But if we define it and we send it without the trailing slash, Flask could redirect it. So that is how the behavior is. Part 2 of hands-on 2 is also done. Now let's go to part 3, and this would be a little bit more interesting. What we are going to do here is that we'll be using multiple URLs, and we'll map all these URLs to the same Python function. We'll not change the Python function. We'll make sure that all these URLs actually are mapped to the same Python function, but the function behaves differently based on the URL endpoint. Of course, we'll have to apply some logic in the Python function for these URLs, which we are going to do. But the main topic of discussion here is that how do we route multiple URL endpoints to the same Python function, or how do you map multiple URL endpoints to the same API in Flask. So this is the same program. So I'll actually add one more API here. So this is the function that I'm creating, select product columns. And in this particular function, what am I going to do is that based on the URL, based on different URLs, this particular function should behave differently. Meaning that if the URL endpoint contains price like this, it would display the product ID, product name, and price. If you mention QTI, then it should display product ID, product name, and quantity. Similarly, for supplier, created, and category, for all these 5 different URL endpoints, what it would do, it would display the product ID, product name, and whatever URL we mention. It can be supplier information, created information, or category. Now, as I said earlier also that this is not something we would do in production. Typically, we would use only one API and get it from the database and return the columns whichever necessary. But here, I want to show you how do you map multiple APIs with the same function. This portion of code is something that you are already familiar with. I'm opening the file and I'm reading the file and I'm getting the product ID. But along with product ID, I want to get product name and price and other things also. So I'll use product name also, which is actually the second element. Now, what I want to do is that I want to select columns based on the URL endpoint. So if the URL endpoint is price, let's say something like this, then what will I do is I will get the price, and I'm naming it as product column because there would be multiple columns, which is the fourth element. So in this case, I'm returning price, which is the fourth element. But what do you match it with? How do you get the URL endpoint? For that, we'll have to get the URL string and we'll have to parse the last word after the last slash. That's what we want to do. Now the question is, how do we get the URL, entire URL? And for that, we'll have to use another class called request, or basically request object rather. We'll discuss request object in the next topic, but anyway, let me just use it for the timing. So we'll get the URL, which would be request.url. So using this method, we can get the URL, and the URL would be the entire URL like this. So now this URL variable would contain this entire URL, but obviously you want the last value, right? You want the price. So I'll have to parse it. Now I'll have to split it using, let's say, forward slash and get the last element. As you already know that once we split a particular string, we get an array, and all these individual values would be element of an array, and we want to get the last element of the array always. So first let us go ahead and split it, and we'll be splitting based on forward slash. And now we'll have to get the last element of the array. How do I get that? So for the first element to use 0, for the second element to use 1, for the third element it's 2, so on. But can we get the last element? We do not know how many elements are there. So Python provides a very neat way to get the last element, which is -1. So -1 would be the last element of the array, -2 would be the second last element, and so on. So I've got the URL, and we'll have to match this URL with price, right? So if the URL variable rather is equal to price, then we will send the product ID, product name, and product column, whatever it is. If the URL is something else, let's say category, right? That's what we mentioned in the hands-on. Then we should get the third element, which is actually the category. And similarly, I will put all the other values also. So this is what it is. If URL is equal to price, we'll get the price, which is the fourth element. If it is category, you'll get the third element, which is the category. Same is the case with quantity, supplier, and created. If none of these are, then of course we'll have to mention an else. And in else, we'll mention that provide a proper endpoint, right? So this is what I'm saying. If nothing matches, I will send a message. Please select the correct column. Now we'll have to send this. So how do I send it? Maybe in a list or in a dictionary. So let me define the list and the dictionary. The list is product list and the dictionary is products dictionary. And once this if logic is done, I will populate the product dictionary with product ID, product name, and the URL variable. So product ID would be product ID, product name would be product name, and URL would be the variable product column. And we'll have to append it to items list. But as you already know from previous exercises that you cannot append it directly. So what will you do? We will append the copy, right? So we'll use products dot copy to append this variable, or sorry, to append this dictionary, and then I'll return the product list. So this is how my code is. Let's do a recap. Let's just walk it through again. This is the code, right? And let me close this. Okay, so this is my code. What I'm getting here is that I'm getting the URL, the entire URL string. So for this, I'm using a request object from Flask module, and I'm using the URL variable to get the URL in URL. This is my function variable, and this is the variable from the URL object. And then I'm splitting it using forward slash, and I'm getting the last element because I want to get the last word after the slash. So because based on that, my logic would be built. And then I'm initializing product list and products as list and dictionary, opening the file. And from the file, I'm getting product ID and product name. Then I'm matching the URL. If it is price, then the column should be price. It should send the price column. If it is category, then it should send the category column, and so on. At the end of the if logic, I'm populating the dictionary with product ID, product name, and the URL, and I'm appending it to the product list using a copy, and then I'm returning it. I hope there's no error, but if there's error, obviously we'll handle it. Now the question is, how do I provide multiple routes? But before that, let's use only one route to see whether it is actually working or not. And now the URL would be a little different. I will add a leveled URL or a multi-level URL like slash product detail and slash price. So whenever we have slash product detail slash price, it should go and show me the product ID, product name, and price for all the records in the file. Let's first see whether it works or not. I'll start the program. Hopefully there's no error. Okay, there is no error. And here I'll be using product detail and price. It is working. It is showing me the price, product ID, and product name. And it is returning all the records, right? So we have 8 records. So all the 8 records are getting returned. So far, so good. And all these are expected. Now the question is, how do we send multiple URLs? That is very simple. You just keep on adding those URLs. As simple as that. So how many URLs do we want? We have price, category, quantity, supplier, and created. 5. So just add 5 URLs. Of course, this would be quantity. Then we'll have category. Then we'll have supplier, and finally we'll have created. So these are the 5 URL endpoints which are getting mapped to the same function. And that's how we map multiple URL endpoints to the same function. The reloading is done. There is no error as such. Well, let's try it out. I'll try quantity now. And as you can see, it is showing me the product ID, product name, and the quantity. Right. And if you see the value that it is showing, it is actually the QTI that you have passed. Correct? Because in the program at the end, if you see, I'm passing the URL variable itself, which would be the name of the column or the attribute in the dictionary. Let's try category, supplier, and created, and all of them should work. So category is also working, and I'm getting the product ID, name, and category for all the products. Supplier should also work. As you can see, we are getting the supplier for all the products. And finally created it, and this is the date. Obviously there's some problem in the formatting. That's fine, that is not something that I want to discuss right now. Now what if we use some other endpoint? Of course it will give the error as usual. So this is how, using this multiple app.routes, we can actually map multiple URL endpoints to the same API. So product detail, price, quantity, category, supplier, and created, all these 5 URL endpoints are actually mapped to the same API, which is select product columns. Now the final piece is opposite to what we have done in the part 3. In part 4, the URL endpoint would be the same, but the APIs would be different. It's the opposite of what you have done. So I had shown you this hash map, kind of hash map table, which Flask could keep in its repository in memory. So the name of the API, essentially it would be the hash of the API actually, the name of the function, and position in memory wherever the program has been loaded. What if we have same APIs but different functions? How it would work? So you can do the hands-on yourself. Pause this video and then try it out yourself, and then come back to the video, or else continue with the video wherein I'll show you. Actually it will be intuitive. You might have guessed what would happen, but of course I want to show you what happens here. First, please go ahead and try it yourself. I hope you are done. Let's match our output. So I'll be creating two APIs, list amount and list amount 2. The logic would be very simple. I want to get the product ID, product name, and product price. That's it. And also function name maybe. And it would be list amount 1, first function. Okay. And similarly, I will do the same in the other function also. Nothing changes except for the name of the function. It would be list amount 2, and I'll name it as second function so that you can see it in the output. And as usual, I will create a dictionary, products and product list. Okay, so I'm assigning the dictionary variables with their value, and then of course I'll have to append it from the copy. And then as usual, I will return the entire list. And the same logic would be there in the second function also. Nothing changes because it's the exact same code. And let me define products and product list. All right, so that's all. Again, very simple, nothing special. The code is exactly same, nothing changes, but there are two different APIs. Obviously, you'll have to use app.route and list amount. This would be the URL endpoint, and we'll have the same URL endpoint in the second one also. So now it is opposite to the previous one. I have the same URL endpoint, but we have two different APIs, list amount 1 and list amount 2, but the API is list amount only. Let's save it and run it. No error as such. Let's try it out. List amount. Okay, so it is showing correct information, product ID, product name, and product price. But if you see, the function name is actually the list amount 1, which is the first function for all of them. Let's try it multiple times. And as you can see, it is sending, or it is using the first API itself. What is the case? What is happening here? You might have guessed that Flask checks the hash table and it executes the first function and then comes out. It does not matter if you have another function or not. So let me change it. What will I do is, I will just use or put list amount before list amount 1. Actually, I'll put list amount 2 before list amount 1. Right? It is working. So it is list amount 2 now. It has changed, and list amount 1 is at the bottom. Let's try it out. Now it should show the second function because that is the first function which is mapped to this URL endpoint. So as you can see, we have list amount 2, second function for all the records. If you run it multiple times, you'll get the same output. So what happens if you have multiple APIs for the same URL endpoint? Only the first API or the first function would get executed. So that concludes hands-on number 2. Let's proceed to the next topic.